Well, again, welcome. Um, we uh, for those of you that don't know Ched, I want to say a little bit about him. He's a fifth generation Californian, an activist theologian, a biblical animator. He's worked in social change and radical discipleship movements for over 40 years. He's authored hundreds of articles, probably 12 books, Ched, and his newest one that was just on the board, Healing Affluenza and Resisting Plutocracy, Luke's Jesus and Sabbath Economics. If you don't have it already, I highly recommend it. It's great for your own personal benefit, but it's also good for group work in your communities or your churches. Um, he lives in Southern California with his partner Elaine Enns. He in the Ventura River watershed. I've known Ched for 20 years. He's probably the first person I've ever heard use the terms decolonizing scripture. I'm guessing not a lot of seminaries are doing that these days, Ched. Maybe that's another webinar, but as the first person I've heard say that, and I often tell folks that I tell him, joke with him that I talk more about his work than he might himself because he's one of my favorite um, scripture teachers, and besides, he's just a really good guy. So, um, just as a reminder, before I turn it over to Ched, please uh, stay on mute. And if you have questions, we're going to have time for questions. Put them in the chat. And after his presentation, we'll get into some of those questions. All right. Thank you, Ched. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Mike. I'm going to just take a minute here to pull up a screen, see if we could get that to work for everybody. How's that? Everybody see that okay?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, wonderful. Um, well, thank you, Mike, for the introduction. As always, I appreciate having the opportunity to engage in scripture study with Faith and Money Network folk. I just want to take a minute because, oh man, how many of these have we all been on? And it's hard to build community, but you see people's faces come up. A lot of you I don't know, um, but some of you I do, and I'm just deeply grateful that you're all here. I want to give a shout out to friends at Langley United Methodist Church in Washington State, where there's a group gathered to watch this program, thanks to the invitation from our longtime companions on the journey, Marcia and Clancy Dunnigan. Um, I also see some dear friends along the way, um, including Mary Sprunger Fraze in Colorado, and Lana and maybe Ted Litton Hatton in Des Moines. Vern Holmes, I think in Northern California somewhere. I haven't seen you in a long time, Vern. Matt Cobb in Minnesota, Ken Gingrich in New Mexico, and our beloved board member, Susan Taylor in Louisville. So that's already quite a spread. And then with all of you, it's a beautiful mosaic of community. So thank you for taking the time and space. Thank you to Mike and Brittany and Heidi and your good team there at FMN for making this all possible. And thanks to all of you for tuning in, especially those of you who have worked with me on some of these texts before, and yet you're back to have more conversation, which is beautiful. So tonight, we're taking on a huge topic, one that has everything to do with how wealth shapes our consciousness. And that, of course, is an issue that deeply shapes the mission of Faith and Money Network. And we'll close by talking a bit more and encouraging all of you to really plug in to the great work that FMN does at so many levels. And I know many of you are here because you're already plugged in, but as we say in our Sabbath economics work, it's always time to take the next step and go deeper. But this study goes well beyond the issue of wealth and money. It's at its core about how narratives shape our faith and practice for good and for ill. So I begin by acknowledging that I'm beaming to you from the little town of Oakview, where we live and work with Bartimaeus Cooperative Ministries, halfway up the Ventura River watershed in Southern California, as Mike said. This is the heart of traditional unceded and untreated Chumash territory, the indigenous people of this place. My prayer is that we all might center our discipleship on working to heal wounds in our place and our people in order to more deeply realize God's vision of beloved community. And the work we're going to do tonight is very much about that. So let's go ahead and jump in. This is a historic moment, as you well know, that we people of faith are witnessing unprecedented efforts to place our scriptural tradition at the service of an autocratic and dangerous administration. There are many obvious incidents of this political intention, whether it's MAGA election protesters brandishing Bibles on January 6th, 2021, or Defense Secretary Peter Hegseth alluding to scripture in prayers for his troops, or the now infamous but darkly bellwether Trumpian social media self-portrait as a healing Jesus earlier this year. All of these, and many that you could think of, all portend the many dangers of Christian nationalism. But friends, issues of mishandling, expropriating, or hijacking scripture certainly predate the Trump era. Indeed, they've been around since the early centuries of the Christian church. Let me offer at the outset an example for the sake of focus. This is a famous trope about the camel in Mark's story of Jesus and the rich man who rejects his call to discipleship. Now, in the Middle Ages, a claim emerged that after the main Jerusalem gates were closed for the night, there was a smaller pedestrian door that opened called the Eye of the Needle. And as long as camels kneeled down and shed their baggage, they would be able to squeeze through. This was a disingenuous effort to subvert Jesus' clear meaning because it threatened the wealthy of medieval Christendom. But this trope stuck around for 1,000 years, comforting the comfortable in countless sermons and churches right up until this very hour. There is, for the record, zero historical, archaeological, or textual evidence from the time of Jesus that supports the existence of such a gate. In fact, invoking the largest animal in the smallest aperture known in their world was a common hyperbole in the ancient Near East, meant to describe something that was utterly impossible. And yet, this interpretation persists. Now, satire is perhaps an appropriate modern response to this long-standing workaround to one of Jesus' clearest and hardest teachings, but I frankly prefer efforts such as Frederick Buechner's famous update of Jesus' analogy into our own socioeconomic context, which effectively restores its bite. The problem is that most folks in our churches have no context for apprehending the teaching of Jesus regarding economic justice because we are so deeply socialized into the simple fairy tale-like narratives of capitalism, which swirl around us and within us 24/7. We have so deeply internalized these stories that when we encounter the gospel perspective on the subject, it literally doesn't compute. So perhaps it might help to see that the Bible is not alone in being hijacked by looking at a different text, if one almost as holy in US culture. I've used this example before in FMN circles, but there is none more clarifying in my opinion. Most everyone watching is likely familiar with this map of the world based on archetypal spaces of the US economy from the Great Depression in the 1930s. Now, if we were together, we'd talk about which of these neighborhoods you grew up in and live in now We even have a giant version of this that we put on the floor and everybody gets up on it. Of course, Monopoly, one of the best-selling board games in the US for nearly a century, is more than a map. It's a pedagogic narrative about how to be successful in capitalism. But this vehicle of sacred myth in our culture was actually hijacked during the first American Gilded Age in the early 20th century. And because it remains relevant to our second Gilded Age today, I want to briefly visit a report in 2022 by NPR. They talked about Mary Pilon, the author of The Monopolists, the scandal behind the world's favorite board game. And it says that depending on how you look at it, Monopoly is the American dream in a board game or a nightmare. For a long time, the supposed origin story of the game appeared right at the top of the game's rulebook. A man named Charles Darrow was down on his luck, unemployed amid the Great Depression and looking for something to pass the time. In 1934, he came up with Monopoly, sold it to Parker Brothers, and became a millionaire, a classic rags to riches American story. But that's actually a made-up story. The game was originally known as the Landlord's Game and was patented by a woman named Lizzie Magie in 1904, at a time when fewer than 1% of patents in the US were granted to women. She created the game as a way to teach people about the nature of monopolies and land ownership and to show the fundamental inequalities of both, which was clear for all to see in the first Gilded Age. Her version of the game became popular among progressive Americans, played by university students, social reformers, even by the famous socialist politician Upton Sinclair. The aforementioned Charles Darrow came across it and, jobless and short on money, took Lizzie's game and pitched it as his own to Parker Brothers. It was the Great Depression and people couldn't afford to do much, but a board game could entertain your family for hours. So Parker Brothers grabbed it, released it as Monopoly in 1934, including that story of how Darrow dreamed up the board game and rescued his family from poverty. No mention of Lizzie Magie ever made. So this is an example of how an original text arguing one thing was turned into its opposite and marketed as the original truth. The hijacked story of monopoly has profoundly shaped our American imagination about money, mobility, ownership, competition, and community, socializing us not to have eyes to see the actual story of capitalism as it plays out among us. Not even restored versions of the game offered in recent years, but without the backing of the gaming industrial complex's power of the mass marketing, economic competition as entertainment, and cultural myth-making, these restorations can not undo the hegemony of monopoly, which is still as popular as ever. Under this myth, concentrations of wealth among the top 10% and more dramatically the top 1% and the domination of politics by the rich and powerful are somehow okay, or inevitable, or the divine will, or they are historical realities that we feel powerless to change. After all, aren't these billionaires simply the winners of that game we all know? So the transformation of monopoly from a critique of capitalist disparity to a celebration of its excesses is a keystone example of the power of hijacking stories of liberation or resistance and turning them into proof texts supporting the status quo. So let's turn back to scripture to focus on a specific but representative text, rather than arguing in generalizations, in order to both specifically illustrate the problem and animate alternative approaches. And I'd suggest it would be good to have a Bible within reach, though we will have the texts on screen, as we take a deep dive to reclaim our sacred stories from their monopoly-style colonization by a capitalist cosmology that is undermining our very faith and practice. Please note your questions as we go, perhaps type them into the chat, and we'll have time for interaction at the end. In the last few centuries of the Christian West, two stories, Matthew's parable of the talents and Luke's parallel, if less famous version of the pounds, have circulated at a very high rate of exchange. In churches, they are ubiquitous as stewardship lessons, but also appear often in wider popular economic discourse as paeans to hardworking people who make profits for their corporate bosses' money. I'd go so far as to say that in our time, these two parables are among the few New Testament texts that a majority of our people somehow know by heart. Thanks, Monopoly. The parable of the talents, which comes up in November of this year in the Year A lectionary, if you're in one of these lectionary churches, it's typically read as a moral lesson about using one's time, talents, and money for God. That triplet, by the way, is now baked into popular discourse. Let's take a moment to see if we can summarize this parable. And I'm going to ask you to type into the chat. I'm going to ask you some questions. And I want you to just type short answers into the chat. Let's see if I can figure out how to do this. I'll back. Who are the main characters? Just type those in. You all actually know the answers to these questions. Who are the main characters of the parable of the talents? And as you're working on that, some other people work on the plot. What happens? Give the basic setup and who are portrayed in this story and how are they portrayed? And finally, another set of you, type in the gist of the basic moral lesson of the allegorized interpretation of this story. As you watch the results come in, marvel at how we know this and how this interpretation has gone virtually unchallenged. Why? Because it coheres so perfectly with the culture of economic meritocracy in the culture in which we live, which trains us to aspire upwards and scapegoat downwards on the social ladder, where success is measured by multiplying the reach of the boss's profit, which, to paraphrase a related adage, will be like a rising tide that will lift all of our own boats. This is, of course, a classic case of spiritualizing parables, following in a long history of turning them into theological allegories. Thus, they are preached, see if you recognize this phrase, as earthly stories with heavenly meanings. Stories about landless peasants and rich landowners, or lords and slaves, or lepers and lawyers, are lifted out of their social and historical context and reshaped into theological or moralistic fables, bereft of any political or economic edge or consequence. When the socio-cultural context indigenous to the story is ignored or suppressed, this approach inevitably recontextualizes the story in terms of our own unconscious political assumptions. So stories meant to challenge our preconceptions are instead used to legitimate them. Never mind how an imposed allegorical schema might defy the coherence of the text. By thoroughly domesticating a parable under our status quo, we effectively hijack the gospel's most powerful rhetorical weapon, whose purpose is to rescue us from our domestication under that status quo. But traditional allegorical readings of this parable are unsettling. Matthew's master clearly promotes ruthless business practices, usury, and the cynical view that the rich will only get richer while the poor will become destitute. This cuts directly against the grain of, for example, Exodus 16's warning against stored surplus, or the multiple prohibitions against usury and profiteering off the poor throughout Torah, or Isaiah's condemnation of those who join house to house and field to field in their real estate dealings. But all that is conveniently forgotten. Moreover, if we concede that the master is a figure for God, it paints a severe portrait indeed, an absentee landlord who cares only about profit maximization and who is harsh and ruthless. Despite such concerns, the parable still routinely occasions countless homilies on the nobility of a system that rewards venture capital, and we end up reading the story exactly backwards. Conversely, the hijacked interpretation soaks into culture. One scholar has noted how, beginning at the dawn of mercantile culture in the late Renaissance, Matthew's key word in English, talents, began to be grafted into our language to mean ability. Problem is, that's a completely fabulated interpolation of the word used in the parable. In the first century, a talent had only one meaning. As a silver ingot weighing between 50 and 70 pounds, perhaps the largest unit of currency in the Hellenistic world, one talent was equal to 6,000 denarii, one denarius being an average subsistence wage for a day's labor in Palestine, thus more than 15 years' wages. This one hunk of cash. In contemporary value, that's roughly $2.5 million. Now, if we were to tell this story plainly, the master gives his first underling 10 $2 million bills to work with. It would likely conjure a whole lot of suspicion by regular folks, so why bother with historical accuracy? Bottom line, Jesus' parable told to poor peasants is hijacked as a self-congratulatory story about investment banking that presses a moral lesson about entrepreneurship. I've even had this parable quoted to me by Chamber of Commerce officials in objection to my Sabbath economics workshops. Recently, under rising Christian nationalism, this unqualified endorsement of capitalism has become quite overt among interpreters, as reflected in these two contemporary Christian right preachers. To them, Luke's version of the parable provides theological justification for the dominant economic system, and very specifically, its prioritizing of unequal prosperity over poverty. But what if, instead, we approached parables as earthy stories with heavy meanings, as my teacher William Herzog put it in this important book, Parables as Subversive Speech? So let's look at Luke's version of this parable as our representative, earthy, heavy story that's been hijacked by the heavenly meaning industrial complex. This choice is for three reasons. First, because it's less known than Matthew's talents tale, in part because the lectionary gives us only Matthew's version, omitting Luke's altogether. Secondly, because Luke's version can help us interpret Matthew's version correctly. And third, because the following analysis is written up in my most recent book, Healing Affluenza, Resisting Plutocracy, so that you can go back to it later. There are three key disciplines by which we need to work at listening to rather than hijacking gospel texts. And it is work, friends. It can't be accomplished in simple sound bites. The first discipline is to restore the literary context, which is to say, let the storyteller speak. Every narrative is a whole cloth, full of intention and internal logic. The easiest way to hijack it is to wrest a text out of narrative context. That's how proof texting works. So how does this parable fit into Luke's overall scheme? Let's recognize three things about his careful architecture. Our parable is the last story in the closing sequence of Jesus' journey toward Jerusalem that makes up the mid part of Luke's gospel. It precedes the passion narrative that starts in chapter 20. It is thus a key episode in the drama that is building and in the turning of the plot. So that's the first thing. Secondly, our parable culminates a sequence that begins and ends with Jesus encountering rich men, one who summarily dismisses him, the other who actually welcomes him, with a surprising embrace of Jesus' call to redistribute his wealth. Thus, our parable further demonstrates the contested economic and political character of Jesus' ministry. So I know this is a lot of data, but this is showing you how Luke has fashioned this story. And thirdly, the parable makes clear that those perceived as sufficiently subversive by the local and imperial authorities of occupied Palestine will be executed, which of course is exactly the fate that Jesus warned his disciples about near the start of this sequence back in 1831 to 33. So obviously the parable must be read through the lens of this whole narrative sequence, not in isolation from it. That's respecting the storyteller. More specifically, it should be read in light of the episode that immediately precedes it, the tale of Zacchaeus. You all know that story. Zacchaeus is manifestly not portrayed as an underling who increases his master's money tenfold, as in the parable. Rather, Zach is someone at the top of the economic pyramid already, yet who embraces Torah's and Jesus' way of Sabbath economics by making restitution to the poor and reparations to those he has defrauded. Jesus ends that story by affirming that his mission is precisely to seek and liberate the lost. That is, those who shattered the family of Abraham by taking too much, but who can regain their belonging through redistribution. Right? So this parable is coming on the heels of this amazing story. Now, to emphasize the tight connection between Zacchaeus and what comes next, Luke says, as they were listening to this, he went on to tell a parable, right? That's a narrative device. It's like a split screen. Here now comes the parable of the pounds, which I contend should be called a parable about the cost of discipleship, because it is meant to temper Jesus' audience and our enthusiasm about the nature and timing of divine vindication, while offering a sobering assessment of the inevitable consequence that arises from proclaiming and practicing radical personal and political change. In other words, it's a warning that this all isn't going to be a happy Hollywood ending. This is an important reality check because there's a long history of messianic enthusiasm that has accompanied revolutionary social movements. Unfortunately, teaches Jesus, history and human nature are a lot harder than the Hollywood ending. There will be no such endings after the story of Zach's class defection. This is in part because lasting change takes more than just an individual turning their life around. The systems and structures of injustice, what the Apostle Paul called the principalities and powers, are persistent, and true transformational movements must learn how to oppose them without becoming them. So here we can visually see how Luke frames the tale. The outer frame begins and ends with two dark references to Jerusalem, which Luke's narrative has already identified with the prophet's fate at the hands of the powers. Right? So that's the outer frame of this text. And that introduces the main figure of the parable, clearly identifying him as an unpopular political leader who is dealing with rebellious subjects. That's the inner frame, the B frame. So between the two B's comes the parable. This is just the setup. So at the outset, the parable is indicating that though Zach may have changed his ways, The wider system presided over by cruel plutocrats has definitely not changed. A second discipline is to acknowledge and study socio-historic context, which is to say, let the story world speak. These stories are deeply grounded in real time and space. They are not free-floating spiritual principles. Wresting a text out of historical context is how allegorist hijacking works. A parenthetic note on this slide. It's interesting that depictions of this parable, talents or the pounds, are entirely absent from the first millennium and a half of Christian art. But right at the time of the rise of mercantilism and early capitalism in the 15th century, the same period that the word talent is being reinterpreted into English, this parable begins to appear in art all over the European world. This is the earliest piece of that art I've found from 1450. By the 19th century, this parable becomes ubiquitous in Christian art. Go ahead, just Google it. Let's walk through this tale in its historic context as well, then. Jesus' original audience would not have had to allegorize the scenario the parable paints to make sense of it. Matthew's portrait of a great household, the closest thing in antiquity to the modern corporation, was all too recognizable on the landscape of first century Palestine. The powerful patriarch would often be away on economic or political business. His affairs would be handled by slaves, who in Roman society often rose to prominent positions in the household hierarchy. But here in Luke's version, it clearly also becomes a political parable. Now we're talking about a nobleman who's seeking royal power. Some political context. When Herod the Great died in the year 4 before the Common Era, his kingdom was divided up by the emperor among Herod's 3 sons into tetrarchies. Herod Antipas was given the region in the north that included Galilee. He is thus the Herod usually spoken of in the New Testament. In the year 14 of the Common Era, Caesar Augustus died and Tiberius eventually became emperor. Herod Antipas had to travel to Rome to lobby the new emperor to remain on his throne against the concerted opposition of many Galilean Jews who hated him for his exploitive policies. So verses 12 and 14 in Luke clearly parody the widely despised Herod Antipas' trip to beg for Caesar's favor. Once Herod was granted power again, he became even more ruthless toward his political enemies back home, and we see this in the parable. So Luke's addition of this detail to the tradition of the parable means to critique the political fragility yet fierce ruthlessness of this very king. Now, some economic background. The mina is an ancient Near Eastern unit of weight equivalent to 60 shekels. It was also a unit of currency. In the first century, a mina amounted to about a quarter of the annual wages earned by an agricultural worker. Calculated according to today's minimum wage, it would be worth roughly $4,000. So it's not chump change, but it's not the fabulous sums envisioned in Matthew's talents tale. These slaves are told to do business with them on behalf of the king. Now, the Greek verb here, pragmatuoste, means to do the work specifically that a money changer or a trader or even a tax farmer would do. That is, make a handsome profit for the king by any means necessary. Now, as you chatted about earlier, the basic plot of Luke's parable is parallel to Matthew's version. First 2 slaves multiply their master's investment through their trading and intensification of the same verb in Luke. Though lauded by modern interpreters, this feat would have elicited disgust from first century audiences. One scholar notes that in antiquity, the highest legal interest rate was about 12%. Anything more than that was considered rapacious. But here, the return of the first trader is tenfold. This is the first of many hints that the operations of this franchise are something less than exemplary. In traditional Mediterranean society, stability was the ideal, not self-advancement. Anyone trying to accumulate inordinate wealth imperiled the equilibrium of society, and so was understood to be dishonorable. Elsewhere in Luke, he shows how greed characterizes the rich, who extort and defraud other members of the community through lucrative trading, tax collecting, and money lending at interest. Nevertheless, these underlings in the parable work the master's system well and are handsomely rewarded. Traders become political rulers. This clearly reflects the patronage system that was how political careers were made in the Roman Empire. Undaunted by this historical context, however, the hijackers press the parable through capitalist lenses, offering nothing but praise for these good stewards. As one scholar summarizes it, commentators of the 19th and 20th centuries have genuinely reveled in the parable's seeming exhortation to venturous investment and diligent labor. Like Monopoly, the discourse has been completely hijacked out of its original social context and turned into its opposite. The third readerly discipline I want to highlight tonight is to pay attention to detail, especially in respect to plot, character, and setting. These are stories full of symbol and caricature and drama. Ignoring that is how embodied narrative is turned into abstract drama. Now, Luke's king turns to castigate the third slave, who, cautious and unproductive, is made into an object lesson of entrepreneurial failure. But if the manner of profiteering portrayed in the story would have been understood by the original audience as rapacious, isn't it possible that this non-cooperating third slave might actually be the hero of this parable? If we read this like a good three-part joke, we've now come to the punchline. The third slave explains his inaction. The Greek word sodarion, handkerchief, connotes a cloth used to wipe sweat or snot or to clean corpses. It's a special cloth. In other words, it was highly unclean, symbolizing the dirty work done by the first two slaves. That's a little peasant humor. Moreover, in a bold move, the defecting slave comes clean. He admits fearing the king as austere, a harsh adjective that appears only here in the New Testament. And now the dissident unmasks the king's operation as profiting off the labor of others, reaping rewards from the sweat of workers. If nothing else does, that diagnosis ought to get our attention and problematize the traditional interpretation of this tale. It is further instructive that the king does not refute this monkey wrencher's analysis. You knew, did you? Repeating the indictment, the dirty little secret is out. Like the typical Hollywood scene in which the villain congratulates the hero for finding him out just before he kills him. Here, the master castigates the non-cooperator as wicked and wonders rhetorically why he didn't at least seek market rate return. The master appreciates only appreciation. The Greek trapezon is wrongly translated as bank. There were no such institutions in antiquity. Rather, it is a table, like the ones on which the temple money changers put their coins, which, as you will recall, Jesus turned over in his temple protest. Even more damning is the ruler's demand for interest. Key vocabulary is part of attention to detail because in literature, everything is there for a reason. So the Greek word tokos means literally offspring, i.e. money breeding money, usury, which, as mentioned earlier, is strictly prohibited in Torah. The word appears several times in the Septuagint version of the Hebrew Bible. It's one of the central complaints that the prophet Jeremiah leveled against the ruling class of Israel, as you see here, and is often simply translated oppression. Ezekiel 2 sees tokos as the cardinal sin of an unjust economic system. It is little wonder that we've never noticed these texts, however. Usury is, after all, the fundamental building block of modern finance capitalism. Well, we could go into the weeds with this, but the Bible was not alone in antiquity in denouncing the sin of making money on money, and it's not a small issue related to this text. No less a sage than Aristotle explicitly condemned profiting by usury. As you see here, usury was understood to be responsible for the destructive cycle of indebtedness and poverty. It is so important to understand this antipathy in their culture, since we have grown so very used to the interest system, that I point you to particularly what's in red. It's the most hated sort of wealth getting. That's usury. And he explains that it's the money birthing money. Unfazed by having been exposed, the ruthless king turns to make an example of the third slave, dispossessing him and giving the spoils to his obedient colleagues. Note the horror expressed by the Greek chorus in verse 25 in red in response to the king's punishment. Why, this is redistribution upwards. Ignoring their protest, the king now delivers a severe lesson about the way his world works. For those who have, more will be given, but for those who have not, even that which they have will be taken away. This is not an allegory for hell. This is an analogy for how the rich get richer, even if the poor are made destitute. That is the logic of the mammon system then and now, and it sounds very much like a certain would-be king today. The concluding violence of verse 47 underlines the fact that the whistleblower is somehow connected to wider political dissent. Herod's notorious security state apparatus is dispatched to stage a public execution that would sow terror into the hearts of any who might think about defying the regime in the future. This, of course, was precisely what the cross represented in the political culture of the Roman Empire, a stake on which anyone accused of sedition would be hung for all to see as a stern warning. Remember, the parable ends with the transitional statement, after Jesus had said this, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. And we all know what happened to him there. So this is indeed a heavy tale, which has for too long been ignored or trivialized as pedantic and platitudinous in order to keep aright the world that Jesus' parables actually mean to turn upside down. So here's some questions that have animated my alternative reading of the story. Do the characters and amounts of money portrayed suggest that this story means to be a sort of political cartoon, which is a very powerful form of storytelling? Given the ancient ethos in which usury was universally condemned, isn't it likely that this story is caricaturing the managers of greed rather than praising them as good stewards? And wouldn't the third slave's speaking truth to power make him a hero martyr rather than a moral reprobate in the ears of Jesus' peasant hearers? Especially when the king agrees with that unflattering analysis. Most importantly, from the narrative point of view, could this parable allude to the likely fate of the defector Zacchaeus? I mean, he was high up in the hierarchy, and look what he did. Or is it a thinly veiled autobiographical story told by Jesus on the eve of his arrest and trial about the inevitable consequences of his practice of Sabbath economics? I know this is a lot and maybe felt like a fire hose, but I hope you can see how exercising these three disciplines, looking at narrative architecture, looking at social context, and attention to detail, how these disciplines can help restore integrity and fidelity to these sacred traditions. Jesus deploys parables to interrogate entrenched arrangements of power and privilege, afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted. In this case, he calls for resistance to usurious business as usual in Israel, which he acknowledges as a risky vocation of truth and consequences. One final discipline for interpretation is the necessary step of thoughtfully bringing the ancient story into our own context, recontextualizing Luke's narrative logic in our world. So I think of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who decided to take public his resistance to the Nazi regime, to both speak out and to refuse certain orders from the state. Like that third servant, his resistance and truth-telling sealed his fate, in part, of course, because other Lutheran pastors refused to stand in solidarity with him. Bonhoeffer understood this as the cost of discipleship, and without a doubt, that famous book and his life are texts for our very moment again. May we have ears to hear. Our parable reflects the character of Luke's entire gospel, which from the beginning to the end both shows and tells the personal and political struggle between two archetypal economies, that of mammon and that of manna. It calls disciples to embrace both of Jesus' strategies, economic practices of renewal and solidarity, and of resistance. So in closing, I want to just point you to a few resources for following up on tonight's conversation. I want to invite you to think about how you can practice the disciplines of really listening to Scripture in order to struggle against all the hijacking going on. Friends, we need folk to work hard to decolonize how we read our ancient wisdom tales, not least around issues of economics. I hope that what we've looked at tonight strengthens in you a hermeneutics of suspicion concerning traditional allegorical and apologetic readings of this and other parables, and indeed of the entire tradition. Let's work together to take the Bible back from those who hijack it for the empire by bringing these stories back down to earth so they can help unmask the real world in its cruelty and to proclaim the radical hope of God's sovereignty. So join the work of decolonizing the Bible, which Mike raised at the top of the hour. And if you want to go deeper into this work, I do commend my study of Luke's Jesus and Sabbath Economics. There are, of course, lots of other literature out there as well. You can find this book online, but you can also purchase it from us at BCM for 40% off. All you got to do is write a nice note to Chris, who's in the next room, making sure I don't crash and burn in this webinar, and he'll get you a book and tell you how to get us a discount price. I also want to mention one other thing. This is something that Mike and I talked about early on when we were planning this session. I said, well, Mike, the parable of the talents is actually coming up, as I said, in November in the lectionary, and maybe this could be a great follow-up practice for folks who are part of this program. Now you've looked at Luke's version, and that really prepares us to really see through the hijacking of the talents parable. And I thought, well, maybe there could be a follow-up little workshop. But November turns out not to be a very good month. It's a busy month with lots of other good stuff going on for Faith and Money Network. But if you are interested in looking at a webinar that does similar work, focusing on Matthew's parable, there's my email. Drop me a line and I'll tell you how you can join a webinar I'm doing with some friends in the UK the week of that text comes up in the lectionary. It's 11/11 at 11:30 a.m. Not super convenient, but if you're interested in that, drop a line. And finally, and most importantly, friends, however much you've done with Faith and Money Network, figure out how to go deeper and go deeper with them. In our opinion, Faith and Money Network is the best shop where we can do our work around economics and discipleship, both personally and politically. So look for their programs, particularly if you've not joined any of their stuff to date. Please make sure that whatever else you do in the wake of this, contact them to find out the programs they're doing, these amazing trips of perspective that they're doing. And above all, in my opinion, the Sabbath Economics Covenant groups, which are really small groups that help us figure out how we embody the example and teachings of Jesus in our fraught world. And I will leave it at there and open it up for some conversation. Thanks for your great time and attention. And I'll turn it back, Mike, to you.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Chad. If you do have questions, put them in the chat. We have some time. We do have one from where to go? Laura asked, Chad, if you could please repeat the 3 ways to approach Scripture.
Sure. I can also make these slides available if that would be helpful to anybody. This gospel work is public domain, right? So let me know on that. Mike, you'll let me know how you want to work with that. But yeah, and there are lots of other disciplines, but the 3 I see as key, and I do outline them in the Healing Affluenza book, are pay attention to literary character and context. Let the storyteller speak. Take the storyteller seriously. Storyteller puts things in the order, in the way, and in the tone that he or she does with intention. When we miss that, we miss the point. The second principle or discipline is to take equally seriously the social and historical context out of which these texts came, because they are from a real world. And if we're going to understand our real world, we got to know how Jesus was navigating his real world. But if his real world looks more like Disneyland than it does like a real world, it's not going to be very helpful to us. So that's where some work comes in, and small groups can crowdsource the labor to find there's so much good work being done on replacing these texts in a real world. And then the third discipline is paying attention to detail, including vocabulary, characterization, plot turns, settings, symbolic settings. All of these things freight the meaning that the traditional storyteller wants to make. And then, of course, the fourth discipline is to thoughtfully figure out how we might retell this story in our world, not to replace Jesus' story, but to put feet on it, put legs on it. Does that help? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. I will say that in the next few days, you all will get this recording sent to your emails. So you'll have this. Anyone who's signed up. Any other questions? Getting a lot of people that are appreciative of this, and
I see while you're waiting to see that, I see Christy put in a phrase saying the widow who gives her one coin is the hero. Yeah, Christy, that's how that text gets preached in church around Stewardship Sunday. Typically, the poor person is a model for generosity. Well, it is true that poor people are innately more generous. And some of the trips of perspective that you can take with FMN can show places where that is the case. But the point of that story in the gospel is not to um, uh, praise her. It is to lament the fact that the temple system would tolerate the complete impoverishment of a vulnerable widow to fulfill tithing obligations. That, in Jesus' mind, is an abomination. That's not what the system is supposed to do. And that's why, in Mark's gospel anyway, as soon as he witnesses that, he turns on his heel and exits the temple and never enters it again and stands out and starts giving a rather elaborate condemnation of that system. So that would be another great case of a contested text.
Chad, Robert asks, how do you find the meaning of the Greek words and their nuances? How do you do it?
Right. Well, they're when I was trying to learn these arts in the 80s, I couldn't just go online. I actually had to learn Greek and try to figure that out. And for scripture, it's great to know Greek, Hebrew, other ancient languages, because that really helps us get past the linguistic barrier. But I'm aware that that's not a reasonable ask for most folk. And there are lots of online programs that will give you interlinear stuff that will translate certain words. For those who don't read Greek because it's a different script, a an interlinear version is the best way to do it, because then you can zero in. You can say, okay, they're saying this word in Greek. I don't know how to pronounce it, but it means this. And then you can go to that word and you'll get a thesaurus. So that stuff is real easy to find online, and there's no good reason not to make use of those tools um, if you are motivated to do that. They are really handy and they're everywhere. The 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 problem is that most of those sites are part of very conservative Christian entities, and that comes through in how they translate that and what they focus on. But if you can just say, thank you very much for giving me this interlinear, and then go to Bible dictionaries and so on. I use Bible Works, but I think that's actually out of, they went out of business because they weren't conservative enough or something. I don't know. But those those things are there. So
Yeah,
I hope that was helpful.
yeah. A more general question from John. Those of us, he says, who are new to studying your work, how do you suggest forming community with each other and with you?
Well, you can go to our website and get on our list. We send out a couple things every month, just like Faith and Money Network does, and that helps you see what we're doing and how you can be part of that. Also, a whole lot of all of our books are there and have descriptions if you want to peruse them. We generally don't ship books out from our office because we're a really small operation, but um, and we will make exceptions, and we'll always give it at a discount. Um, so you can take that up with Chris. He's a good disperser of resources here. And most importantly, getting a local group, a local discipline, whether that's weekly, biweekly, even monthly, to tackle a text and read it whole, right? Part of taking the storyteller seriously is to read a text whole, not just cherry pick it. The Luke book isn't a verse by verse commentary of the whole gospel because Luke's material is a third of the New Testament. It's a huge undertaking, but it is a thematic study of Luke. But our work from Mark are verse by verse of that whole shortest of all of our gospels, and we have other texts as well, and a lot of articles that have been published over the last 30, 40 years you can find. So Chris has worked hard on making those things searchable on our site. But the best thing you can do is join a Faith and Money Network study group. And I think from time to time, Mike, you all have done some Bible study stuff
Oh yeah.
online. So
All of our work has scripture around it
yeah,
and through it for sure.
yeah.
So, hey,
So
Chad, Joe has a good question. I think probably more than a few of us are thinking. Joe writes, "How do we communicate this stuff when it takes time
yeah,
to explain
yeah,
away our capitalist
yeah,
assumptions and the socioeconomic context? It's not something that you can do in a soundbite,
right.
for sure." What advice would you give us?
You know, I feel that every day in my bones. It's vast work. It's broad and it's deep and it touches on everything. And so I do believe it is uh, part of our life work to work at this. And discipleship is a life work, and I think um, we are invited to be stewards of our sacred stories, particularly in a moment when they're being hijacked. Uh, and so, Joe, just chip away at it. And so tonight we just looked at one text to try to see how this works. And the next step is to look at another text and another text and to start like any discipline, get some muscle memory, build some skills, um, some competence, some familiarity with things. It, unfortunately we don't get trained anywhere to do this, not even in church. And but it's not impossible. And deep religious traditions have always centered on um, deep, long-standing disciplines of practice. And that also means that we have to become more literate in the economics that surround us in a critical fashion. And that's also a lot of work. But so I typically will point people to United for a Fair Economy and inequality.org
Mhm.
as the best place to kind of get some of the critique in a popular fashion. That's their whole vocation, and they do amazing work at it. You can sign up and they'll send you something every day that is helping decode and demystify the economy we're in. There are so many people doing this work. So at the end, like anything else, it comes down to our determination to try to start to do a few things and do them well, as Francis said, and build on that, and not give up that it's too big. That's precisely what the system wants us to believe, is that this is just too hard. It is challenging, it is demanding, and you can't really do it by yourself, but a study group can go a long way to exercise these disciplines. And so I just can't emphasize that too much. So you've already, showing up at things like this is really important, really
Chad,
important.
Laura would like to hear some ideas about how to use the biblical parables to resist the wealth inequality today.
Yeah. Um, well, Luke's got a lot of them because Luke actually Luke has the most parables of any gospel, and most of his parables are about social and economic inequality. So if you want to tackle Luke, there's some great resources on how to use some of his parables. Luke even has Jesus in Luke chapter 15 go to a dinner party, um, and at the dinner party he tells a parable about being at a dinner party um, where people are not mindful of disparity. It's just awesome. It's a parable wrapped in a story, wrapped in a parable. Um, so there's just so much there, Laura, that and I think parables are a good entree point for people because they're stories. And even though they're in many ways hijacked stories, that storytelling and story literacy is the one competence that is still relatively universal in our cultures. Everybody more or less knows how to work with a story. And, we all know about figuring out what the plot is and who the characters are and what the setting is. And so I think it's a really good entree into looking at wealth inequality and pairing a parable story and maybe a story from the real world of socioeconomic disparity. And again, inequality.org can point you to lots of storytelling around that. And then looking at those stories synoptically and letting them, that's kind of fun to do that. It's like art, trying to find those two things that will ping on it off each other. Um, and I think you'll find that even though, see, economics is taboo. We're not supposed to talk about economics in the culture, which means we also are not supposed to talk about it in church, except on Stewardship Sunday. Um, that taboo, that is the silencing of dissent. We've got to break that silence. We've got to break that taboo. And one way to do it is to do some storytelling that's fun and that's poignant. So I hope as general thoughts, I'm much better at just taking a case in point as we did today. And there's no, four easy steps to firmer thighs here, but there is
Hmm.
a lot of there's a lot of juice in storytelling that I think can really be attractive to people and be nurturing for you as the facilitator. Did you get somebody's going to respond to Jay about
Yeah, yeah.
faith and money? Good.
There are not any, but we ours right now are online. And
Hmm.
so there, I mean, in the best of worlds, you're sitting around a kitchen table with your neighbors and you're doing this together around food. But right now, it doesn't seem to be happening as much. Um, and the benefit of doing the Zoom groups are that you can have. We've had uh, an African American Southern Baptist in a group with a Zen Buddhist, a pastor from South Korea, in with a UCC person from Oregon. It's been a great way to get a wide view of a range of people working at this stuff together. That's the upside.
Yeah, that's the
Of it.
upside for sure. Thanks, Ken, for the question about songwriting, and you got a lot of Bruce Coburn fans
Yeah,
who are weighing in, and he's a good one. Charlie King, good friend and a longtime labor song writer and troubadour, and who's also a devout activist Catholic and scripture uh, scholar, grassroots scripture scholar, charlieking.org. He's another one I'd really recommend. Um, I am seeing Bill Raditz,
yeah.
and Bill, it's been so long since I saw you, Bill. When I knew you, you were down in San Diego. Maybe you still are. We worked together on issues of the US-Mexico border around immigrant rights in the 1990s. It is really nice to see your name come up. Thank you. And yeah, thanks for everybody. Really appreciate it. Joe, again, asking a great question. Anyone rewriting the parables, but in our context? Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of novelists are, and fiction is not my great strength, but I would keep your eyes out for it because I think parable writing is seen as a literary people know how powerful parables are, and undomesticating them and recontextualizing them. So I think there are people doing that. I just am not thinking of anybody off the top of my head, but that would be a good thing to go chase after. And I see you're getting some responses there. So
Anybody else before we? Well, thank you, Chad. This has been terrific and definitely thought-provoking. And I would add too that one of the things we do at Faith in My Network, if you just have some ideas yourself, or you just want to talk, email me. And if I don't know the answers, I might know somebody who does, and I can point you in their direction. But it's just important that there's no bad question. We're all at different places with this work, and we all need each other. And the more we can get it out of our heads and speak it and find others, we may know folks in your neighborhood that we could connect you with, even if it's just a couple people. So, Brittany, do you have any final?
I've addressed it in the chat, but I'll just remind folks that we are recording this and we will send the recording link likely by the end of the day tomorrow. So that'll be live for you all. We'll also send some notes and links to the things we've discussed here, including the email address for Chad's book to get that in-house discount and a few other things, including that November possibility. So stay tuned for more. And thank you for being here.
Thanks,
thank you,
everyone.
Brittany, for all your work.
Yeah, thank you, Brittany. Take care.